Welcome to the third and final session of today. You've got me again. I promise I don't come back again in this conference. It's the last time. And this session is going to be on recommender systems and also more generally data-driven markets. It has been missold a little tiny bit in the programme because actually what the speakers wanted to speak about changed very slightly. So you can draw inferences from what is going to be said about music streaming, but there's not going to be that much focus specifically on music streaming. Our topic discussants may cover music streaming a little bit. But music streaming is a great example of a recommender system, or in particular, the playlists that music streaming sites create are a perfect example of recommender systems. So they come up with, your daily mix. That is a recommender system, things that you personally might like. So in general, we're going to be talking about recommender systems, and you will be aware that they are everywhere online now. I mean, Spotify and streaming sites are one example, but if you search for something on Amazon and you get a ranking, then essentially that is a recommender system, or a hotel on booking.com, or if you search for something on Google, all of these are effectively recommender systems. And they bring us huge benefits in terms of enabling us to discover new things that we will enjoy, to find the most suitable product for our needs. Essentially, a recommender system is an algorithm which delivers recommendations. It can be more or less sophisticated, and it can be very basic. It can have machine learning. It can be general, so we all get the same recommendations, or it can be individualized, so we get personalized recommendations. So there's a huge spectrum of types of recommender systems. What we're going to be looking at least in a couple of the papers on this panel, is what are the implications for recommender systems in markets. And also then thinking about competition issues generally in markets where this much data is used, so data-driven markets. This is a really interesting, very, very topical issue. We heard earlier about the importance of algorithms going forward and all the work that is being done on algorithms and AI. So I think I will shut up basically and get on with the speakers. The first speaker today will be Professor Peter Ormosi. He's Professor of Competition Economics at Norwich Business School at UEA. I am a co-author on the paper he's going to be presenting, although he's in fact taken the work somewhat already beyond what's in the paper that's on SSRN, and really all the proper thinking is by him anyway. And he's going to be looking at the implications of biases in recommender systems for market outcomes.
Thank you, Amelia. I'm not sure about the proper thinking, but I have put in some time into this paper. Two things to put forward before I start. One is, this is really work in progress, to the extent that we've just recently won a grant from the Trustworthy Autonomous Systems Hub, which is a UKRI funded hub. It's run by computer scientists, and really the work only just started a few weeks ago on this. So what I will present is some of the very preliminary simulation results are really, you should just take them with a pinch of salt. These are early findings. I just wanted to spice up the presentation a little bit. Otherwise, this is just a scoping paper of our thinking, where the main issues or the main interesting research questions could lie in recommender systems. And the other thing I need to put forward is that I love recommender systems. I think without them, the world would be a much poorer place. And I do believe, having spoken to people who work as engineers and designing recommender systems, is that they are genuinely wanting to produce something that helps consumers find the things that they want or they didn't know they wanted, but that really helps them. And nevertheless, there are issues which we kind of think that we would need to study, not because we're being negative or I just want to kind of go on a 20-minute bash on recommender systems, but it's rather the fact that there are some unanswered questions that, as economists, of course, we are interested in, and we haven't found many people to be looking at these questions. So hopefully this will be useful. Okay, just to give a motivation, actually Amelia has already given the motivation. This is about recommender systems which are ubiquitous. I think, you know, if you read any paper on digital markets and digital competition, it kind of starts with a statement like that. You know, this thing is nowadays ubiquitous. Well, recommender systems are. Whatever you do online, it's very likely that what you see on your screen is given to you by a recommender system. If you go on LinkedIn, the jobs you see are selected by a recommender system. The things you see when you go on Amazon, the music that you get recommended, the films you get recommended, and so on. The reason we think this is a really interesting competition question is, well, this is kind of one of the main reasons, is that consumers, when they get given recommendations, I don't know, should I step back and then it will, no, okay. Consumers, when they get given recommendations, they tend to click on those recommendations, they tend to engage with those recommendations. And because of this propensity to engage with it, there is a very strong likelihood that if the recommendations are in some extent biased, then it will have an impact on competition between the suppliers of those products that are being recommended. So to make it really clear which part of these kind of platform markets we're looking at, hopefully this diagram will help. So we're focusing on competition between, it hasn't got a laser pointer, competition between the suppliers that are selling products on a platform, and consumers are engaging with these platforms, and a recommendation is made on the platform. Sure, there are lots of interesting questions regarding competition between the platforms who deliver these recommender systems. That's not really in our focus. Right now, we're looking at suppliers. And the other thing that's important is we're looking at platforms where we're assuming that there is really no hidden agenda. So these recommendations are about giving consumers the best fit, well, a recommendation that best fits their preferences. This kind of computer scientists refer to this as the relevance kind of objective function that the platform is trying to maximize what's most relevant for the consumer. Okay, a very brief kind of run through what recommender systems are. Just to start with some definitions, the platform is the digital marketplace which deploys the recommender system. Suppliers sell their products on these platforms. So if you think of Spotify, it's the music companies who put their products, which are the songs, on Spotify or on Amazon, the retailers selling their product. Consumers are the buyer side of the market, and we often refer to consumers as users, and items are the goods and services that are sold here. What's very important is the way consumers interact with these items. It's important because that's kind of a new data point that the recommender system collects and learns from. One key aspect of recommender system is its objective function. So what is it that it's trying to maximize? And as I started off, at the beginning, we're assuming that it's only trying to maximize relevance. So what is a recommendation that the consumer would prefer if the consumer knew about all the products on the platform. But there could be other objectives that the recommender system may be pursuing. Of course, because if it's delivered or it's deployed on a platform, the platform is probably maximizing their profit. And there are ways of introducing this into our thinking, but we kind of want to take a step-by-step approach. But certainly possible to think of multi-objective systems. Other objectives that it could be maximizing, things like novelty, diversity, and my favorite one is serendipity of a recommendation. It's kind of like, you know, what's a good Christmas present? A good Christmas present is something that the person who's receiving it didn't know they would love. So that's in my definition as well, a good recommendation. You know, if I listen to indie music, for example, then of course, buying me an indie CD is kind of a safe bet. But I think a good recommendation is if somehow the recommender figures out that, oh, this guy might also like, I don't know, Mississippi Delta Blues, and recommends me something, and I say, wow, you know, this is really good, and this is what I'm going to listen to now. So this is what the literature refers to as serendipity. And of course, the more objectives you have, the more complex this problem becomes. The best way to think about recommender systems is like as it's a pipeline which has got various stages. First stage is when it collects the data. So it could be data on the items that is being sold on the platform, data on the consumers who interact with these items or who are buying things on the platform. Then this data is used to train a recommender algorithm. And there are different types of models that could be deployed. I will talk about this in a minute. Then this model, once it's trained, it will make recommendations to a person. Now, the platform needs to decide how this is going to be delivered to the consumer, and it's done through some sort of choice architecture. Could be just a simple list, where it does matter what's on top of the list and what's at the bottom of the list, so the ranking matters. But it could be some other sort of online choice architecture design. Once this is recommended and is delivered to the consumer decides whether to and how to interact with it, whether it's going to look at it, click on it, engage with it, even buy it, or just ignore it, or swipe up, or swipe down. Even these kind of implicit signals are all collected. And this interaction is then collected, and it's fed back into the recommender system. This is now new data, and then it's retrained on this new data, and this circle, it goes on and on and on. So the computer science literature on recommender systems is immense, and it's ever increasing, especially in the last few years, and particularly about biases in recommender systems. Now, I kind of have to stop here and define what bias is, because computer scientists really only mean, but under biases, they really only kind of talk about the fact that it's not recommending the thing that would maximize the consumer's utility. So it's not about statistical biases. It could be statistical biases, but it's really just a shorthand expression to refer to recommendation that is not the optimal recommendation. So there are biases in how the data is collected. And a simple thing is, probably the most simple one, is selection bias. If the data is collected through explicit reviews, so people leave reviews on let's say Netflix about a film, well, that of course is not done for every film, and we're more likely to review certain types of films or certain groups of films, and certain type of people are more likely to review certain other specific types of films. In any case, we don't have a random distribution of, or a uniform distribution of data on all the items that are being sold on the platform. And of course, if the algorithm doesn't know anything about a certain product, it's very unlikely that it's going to be recommended, or the recommendation will be imprecise. There could be biases at the step where the algorithm is designed, and these biases could come from the design. Without going into too much detail on this, there are different types of recommender system algorithms. You might have heard about collaborative type algorithms, and that's actually the one that I'm probably going to go into in a bit more detail. So in a collaborative filtering, the idea is that if there are two consumers, and these two consumers are similar, and one consumer engages with, let's say, items X, Y, and Z, and there's another consumer who has engaged with item X and Y, then the algorithm will read it as okay, these two consumers are similar because they both engaged with X and Y, so it would make sense to recommend Z to the second consumer because the second consumer hasn't yet looked at or engaged with Z. Okay, that's great, and it's kind of a simple logic. The problem is, if there's also an item V, and let's say item Z is very, very popular, and a lot of people are kind of consuming X and Y, and also Z, but only a few people engage with X and Y and V as well, maybe because V is new, or maybe it's a more niche product. But if B has consumed X and Y, it could also be recommended V. But because the algorithm has got less data on V, it's more likely to recommend Z. So V really has got very little chance to come into play and to be seen by consumers. Now, why this matters is because, I have to go back to the first slide. We're talking about platforms that bring together products that are so numerous that it's impossible for consumers to look at each one of them. If you think about Spotify, the many tens of millions of songs, you really will have to go ahead with what is recommended to you. And if certain products are, just because they're new, they have no chance of being recommended, that will impact competition between these suppliers. The next step is delivering the choice or designing the choice architecture. This is more linked to the behavioral economics and cognitive biases, positioning bias, framing bias could all come into play here. But really the most important thing here is just to remember that we're looking at these steps and there are potential new sources of biases coming in at each step. And potentially even at the last step when the users interact. Users might not interact with all things, they only interact with things that they're being exposed to. So when you add this all together, really the point of our research and why we're doing is that we need an understanding how all these different sources of biases will have an impact on competition between suppliers. And what makes it even more pronounced is what's called feedback loops. So the fact that things go around and new data is generated and that's being read and that's being, the algorithm is being retrained on this new data. This could amplify biases. And once again, computer science literature has shown how it amplifies biases. But then we become interested, okay, if it does amplify the biases, and if it does create, for example, entry barriers, or if it concentrates markets, just how bad it becomes, how quickly it becomes bad, and most importantly, what can we do? Okay, so this is really where the kind of competition policy part starts. What does it mean for firms that are trying to sell their products on a platform? So again, this is just summarizing our thinking. Consumers are likely to engage with these recommendations. If the recommendations are biased, it will mean that demand will be driven away from some suppliers to other suppliers who are really only being recommended because of these biases, or really only being disproportionately recommended because of these biases. So it will have an impact on competition. To start with, barriers to entry and expansion, as when I was talking about the popularity bias example that I was alluding to, if you're a new product, the recommender system doesn't know much about you. You might maybe really good at supplying information to the RS, but the recommender also needs to know how much people have engaged in the past with these products. And this is often referred to as a cold start problem. Well, in economics, we kind of refer to this as a potential barrier to entry. Now, if there are barriers to entry, and if these are being amplified by the continuous feedback loops, then that will have an impact on competition. This should start playing now, but obviously it doesn't. Is there any way of clicking on this? It's not a big deal if it doesn't work. So I just wanted to give an example about the role of data availability as an entry barrier. So I said, okay, recommenders are learning from the data that's made available to them. Okay, that's fine. Not everyone's providing the same amount of data. So to give one example on Spotify, if you're a very famous artist, and if you are, if you're part of a major record label, you're going to have support, which means that you are providing a lot of information and a sufficient type of information to Spotify to make sure that Spotify knows who you are and what kind of music you're playing and who that sort of music might appeal to. Whereas if you're a small independent artist who actually is doing everything on their own or just through small record labels, you might not be so good at providing data or knowing what data to provide. The simulations we run here and what you would see is how the number of recommendations develop if you simply just don't have enough data on some products or you have less data on some products in comparison to other products. Now, this is all fine. It's probably an important practical issue. I don't think this is a competition policy issue. I think in my reading, a lot of this is about some firms being less efficient. If they don't know what data to provide, or if they can't do that, well, yeah, it's bad. But there might be, or maybe there should be, some other policy tools to remedy that. However, what's a competition policy issue is that if, as a result of these entry barriers, market concentration increases, how quickly is it going to dissipate? So, if we look at markets with blockbuster effects, well, these are dynamic markets, so we can be sure that or it's likely that any sort of market power is going to be replaced very quickly. But how often is this the case if we're talking about manufacturers selling their stuff on Amazon? Well, we don't know yet, but it will play an important role. If we just look at the first set of simulations we run, this shows how quickly, I mean, these are totally the wrong slides, very wrong slides. Anyway, this shows how quickly market concentration increases. Over, on the horizontal axis, you see the number of iterations we did in our simulations, and the vertical axis shows concentration ratio for the largest 10% of the items. Now, here in this simulation, we're talking, thousands of items, and depending on which recommender system design you're using. So these are just different types of algorithms. It could go up to very concentrated markets very quickly. So the worst one is, of course, popularity-based recommendations, because what popularity-based recommendations are things like YouTube used to do this in the early years, and actually news recommendations are often kind of largely based on popularity-based recommendation systems. It means that the most popular thing is recommended to everyone. And of course, you can very quickly kind of get into a spiral where it just doesn't stop. On the other hand, things like content-based recommendations, which learn more about the product, and not just like who engages and with what, are less of an issue in this respect. Still increase market concentration. The other concern is increasing homogeneity. If recommender systems are deployed, and if they tend to recommend the most popular items, then you get, you're kind of losing the beauty of the long tail items, which actually is what makes, let's say, internet shopping or music streaming platforms really interesting for many people. Well, that's the kind of the pool of the new artists and the different things, because everyone is being recommended the most popular things. If you go on Spotify, don't be surprised if you get recommended Adele or Drake, even if you never listen to them. Again, this increasing homogeneity kicks in very quickly if you run those. Again, what we're using here is just simple algorithm designs that are fairly common in practical recommender systems. Okay, because I'm running out of time, I would like to spend a minute on kind of implications for antitrust. Because although I think a lot of these things are really interesting, and I'd love to come back in a year's time when our project has finished, and where we have actually some results, and we will have done some, not just the simulations, some empirical work as well. I do think, on the face of it, it doesn't look like many of these issues are easy to be picked up by competition policy. However, there are some implications which I think could be important. For example, if recommender systems do increase entry barriers, and if there is this tendency to more homogeneous markets, then this is maybe something that we should be considering if we're looking at platforms, let's say mergers between platforms or market power on platforms, and know what the implications of recommender systems will be. And the other thing is, which I think is a really interesting question, with recommender systems, maybe we need a small paradigm shift how we think about relevant markets. Most recommender systems that are really useful are personalized. Now, it means that you don't walk into the same store as I do on any day. If you go on Amazon, you see a different set of products from me. You go on Spotify, it's all different. So how do we define markets in these settings? It could be that there are two suppliers providing very similar products, and if they were in a high street, you would think of them as competitors. It's very likely in these recommender system settings that the same two products will not be recommended to the same customer. So are they still in the same market? Okay, so I'll stop here. There's lots of issues. We haven't even got to the point where we talk about self-preferencing recommender systems, but maybe at the next presentation. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a tough tough timetable here. Does anyone have any questions for Pete? I'm standing up so that I can keep an eye on the online questions in case anyone online wants to submit some questions. But anyone in the audience? We will be coming back. The third session is actually going to come back to one particular type of recommender system and go in a bit more depth. So we'll be coming back to some of these issues. No questions? We've exhausted you. Okay.
Just a very quick question about some of the relations that you showed. Were these using the same recommender system by every one of those? Okay, sorry. Was this a simulation where you were assuming that everybody was using the same recommender systems?
No. Let me just go to this one. No, these were. I'm just plotting it on the same thing. So for these simulations, we're assuming that very simple things about the consumers and how they engage with it, but these are recommender systems. So is your question about these results being comparable across the algorithm?
No, I mean, okay. You're showing us market shares.
Okay.
If you're showing us market shares, you had several firms competing against each other,
okay. Yeah.
having recommender systems. So my understanding was that you're then doing the same one for every one of the firms, when you're looking at the market, you're looking at the share of the 10% or items.
Yeah, so at this stage we're not talking about firms, we're talking about products, so we're kind of assuming that each firm is one product. It's a first step, so of course we'll then make it more complex, and we say, some firms could have several products. So this is the market share of let's say the most popular products that are most likely to be recommended. And we run through, so the same firms or the same items, so to say, we use for each of the recommendation system designs. So we say, okay, let's simulate the items and then run the different recommender systems on the same set of items.
And then I was confused because I would be expecting that you're talking about competition. And my question really is, if you have competition between different stores, that's the level at which the recommender system is actually chosen, whether that wouldn't lead to a lot more experimentation and
that's the interesting question that we care about. I mean, it's a bit like theoretical models. You say, okay, we have each item is one brand or each item is one store. We can make it more complex, for example, by assuming some level of correlation between certain sets of products which come from a different or a specific brand. Or we can introduce, if it's content-based, the recommender system could learn about the context and the characteristics of a product, which could be a brand. So if you see the brand Apple, for example, you might be more likely to choose that or click on it because you're already familiar with the name. However, some of the recommender systems alone, they can't pick this up. For example, let's say a matrix factorization. It really only learns about previous engagements with user engagements. So you cannot really introduce any specific item level information, whether it's the same brand or whether it's this sort of relationship between these different items.
But I think you might have been saying something about the choice of recommender systems by platforms, and essentially this simply assumes one platform and looks at in the market. We're not looking at competition at the platform level at all, and it's saying what would happen to upstream supplier competition based on the choice of recommender system by that one platform that they're all selling through. Okay, thank you very much. Right, I think, can we come back to it? Because I've got a big time sign up coming up here. Thank you. So next I'd like to invite Jens Prüfer to come and speak. He's going to be talking about data-driven markets, which is not the same but similar. He is assistant professor at Tilburg, but as you heard earlier, he is about to come and join us at UEA in the economics department as professor of economics.
What do I need to do? Oh, click. No,
You might need to speed on.
not my slides.
You just need to keep
Oh,
going
yeah.
forward.
Yeah, okay, this one. Great. Welcome, good afternoon. My name is Jens Prüfer. As said, I'm still in Tilburg, but on my move kind of to this fine place as of September. I would like to speak to you actually about two connected empirical papers that together will try to answer the question, is the search engine market data-driven? Well, you could say there could be more interesting questions than this one, right? But I will try to convince you that this is a super interesting question and that actually this is only an exemplary question for a broader class of questions that we can answer here. And because this work has been around for a little bit, or at least we've worked on it for quite a while, I will speak about policy. And so that's maybe then hopefully the thing. So this is joint work with an entire range of co-authors, because actually on the program, all of them at Tilburg University or at Center Data Research Institute connected to Tilburg University. And so this is a very nice kind of exercise of interdisciplinary work where economists, econometricians, data scientists, consumer researchers, in the end even legal scholars kind of contributed to a larger project. If I'm trying to kind of argue what the content is and why this is important, we have to take a real step back and say, what are we doing here? The digital markets. And so the context is there's this broad process of datafication that we all know about. Datafication kind of coming through three different angles, basically. The first, that we have big data, we have more and more data sets available. The second one, we have decreasing hardware prices, like through sensors, through kind of computing power that is available more broadly. We have more data. And of course, at least since in the last 7 or 8 years, gigantic leaps have been made by computer scientists in developing machine learning techniques. Right? All of this together has been called datafication by Victor Meyer-Schönberger and Ken Cook here. And I think this technological change which is coming upon us is just one of the major questions next to climate change, and so which we just have to understand. And so this is also what I find very interesting, with respect to what are the consequences of datafication for society, for politics. Today, however, in a very classical, I would say, economics perspective, I will have a closer look at what does datafication do to markets. And one specific type of markets, namely those where competition is most affected by datafication. And these ones are which we call data-driven markets. And now it's important that we get the definition right. So the definition that I will be working with is a data-driven market is a market characterized by indirect network effects driven by machine-generated data about user preferences and characteristics. That's the important part. So if I speak about data, it's data about user preferences or characteristics. Who are you? What do you want? Where are you located? What are your language skills, preferences, whatever. This is the type of data, very personal. And on these markets, the marginal cost of innovation are decreasing in demand. So this is a technical definition. Not big surprise, because the two papers cited here are game theoretic papers or applied game theory papers. However, they have very practical, intuitive consequences. And what I will be telling you right now, you may have heard in some very connected language this morning in the first panel already, in particular from the colleague from DG Com. So the situation is the following. You imagine one market, and I say the market is data-driven if the following thing happens, that there is computer-aided communication between consumer and producer, and then if one of the producers, could be a platform, has a higher market share than competitors, then higher market share means I have more access to users. Hence, I have more data about users. There are just more user interactions by definition, right? Consequently, if I have more user information, and if I'm on such a data-driven market, then this will decrease my cost to innovate, right? That's the trick. Like, if this happens, then we have a data-driven market. So, and if I have cheaper costs of innovation right now, then I will innovate a bit more. That's incentive compatible. We can show that when in all kinds of models. And consequently, I will have a better product tomorrow. And consequently, I started with a slight advantage in market share today, and tomorrow, kind of generically, I will have a larger advantage, a large advantage, a large advantage. This leads to what we call market tipping or monopolization. So this is kind of, you may say, okay, I've heard about that, not so spectacular. What is maybe a little bit spectacular, the 2012 paper cited here is the first paper in economics that that wrote down this process. And so this is kind of what that formed the language of part of the policy discussions that we've seen since. So it has had quite kind of some policy impact, and now, and I do not know, Olivier Gerson kind of could maybe tell us more, but at least correlationally, the major policy proposal that has been made, has been brought up in these papers, kind of is right now in the Digital Markets Act. This is namely mandatory sharing of such user information with competitors. And so, if from my perspective the world goes right, and what we heard this morning, which should be end of 2023, then at least for the search engine market, kind of Google will be forced to share certain kinds of user information with its competitors, which may have a gigantic impact. Now, maybe I should have said, because the second last bullet I did not tell too much about. So the point is, what is shown here on a data-driven market tipping in the long run is inevitable. It will happen. And this is bad. Why is it bad? Because it reduces innovation incentives of new companies, young companies, because they know I don't stand a chance against the big company, the incumbent that has all the data. So I will never be able to compete with them, because kind of whatever I do, they can do the same at lower cost. I will be kicked out. I do not kind of get my investment back, hence I don't invest. I stay out. This is what we empirically observe. And then as a best response, kind of the incumbent also can save a little bit on innovation, because they have all the market, or virtually all the market anyways, right, even without investing so much. But the problem is that we see too little innovation in these markets. Right? And so that's a theory of harm, and now that's what these papers suggested. This can be repaired, or at least mitigated, by mandating the sharing of user data. Now, this has already had quite some policy impact. However, I have to admit, and many people pointed at it, this is pure theory. So come on, what can theory do? And this is why, like 2 years ago, starting 2020, the German Finance Ministry came to us and said, look, we think you might have a point here, but can you please show it? Can you collect some data? Can you show it empirically? And this is basically why we developed a test that can be applied at the level of one market or one industry, and which tests this market for data-drivenness. And this graph on the right basically shows what the content of the test is. So first, if you have a look at the lower kind of arrow, the question is, we have to assess whether on this market more demand for one company leads to more data, or more data about user preferences and user characteristics. That is more user information. And on most digital markets, this is a no-brainer. This is just given. Second, much more complicated, and this is what Pete also just alluded to when he said data availability is not a competition issue. I challenge that. Like the second question is, does more data actually lead to higher quality of the product? Or is higher quality kind of a function of something else? For instance, a better algorithm. And finally, if there is better, if one company has better quality, is this the elephant in the room for consumers' choices, for demand, or do consumers value other things like privacy, or like seeing less ads, or what have you, right? These are all empirical questions, and here kind of we are trying to study this, and now in order as a kind of a proof of concept, we delve into one market, and that is the search engine market, right? So search engines, kind of just as a background, you see this nice graph. This is market share data from 2019, so pre-COVID. And basically what you see here, if you have sharp eyes, is that apart from China and to some extent Russia, Google is super dominant in all markets, right? So I mean, that's a no-brainer for most of us. It's just kind of a slight reminder, right? Market shares above 90% are completely usually here. So these are many, many tipped markets. That's kind of my point. Now, if we have a look, if I go one slide back, kind of the lower kind of connection here, does more demand lead to more data? Of course it does on search engines. So this is not something that we need to study, because the interaction between a user, me typing in something, and then getting kind of a list of URLs and making a choice, this is of course logged in so-called search logs or query logs. So this is what search engines kind of for free. This is the data they get for free. They get some more data for free, my IP address and so on. So that's basically the first thing. Now what is much more interesting, on the search engine market, does more data inevitably lead to higher search quality? And that's an empirical question, and we did have the opportunity to study this, and I think it's the first paper that had this opportunity, because we could run an experiment with a real search engine. The search engine is called Clicks. So for the first time ever, it's not kind of Google, it's not Bing, it's not Yahoo, it's a small search engine, Clicks, based in Munich. We got kind of together with them in April 2020, and so they gave us data for 1 week of search that were made on their site, kind of between April 20th and 26th. We got the data April 27th, and here comes the kind of business crime story. 3 days later, on April 30, they went out of business. So the theory was just kind of confirmed in a very harsh way. So what you see here is basically, so we got the real queries from Clicks. In parallel, on the so what they did is basically they took all their search queries. A search query is you enter into this search box London Ethiopian restaurant. That's one search query, and then you get a list of many URLs. We only look at the top 5 URLs, and this would be your search results set, right? Just to get the language right. And so what they do is kind of they ordered all the queries they got within this 1 week according to popularity. So you see the most popular query was searched for 150 times. And then they ordered, they sorted them in 5 buckets. Most popular, somehow popular, middle popular, not so popular, rare queries, right? So that's what you see. So for instance, in bucket 1, kind of the most popular queries, the average number of searches for the same search term was 72.1, whereas in bucket 5, kind of the average number of searches was just 1, very little data. And this is then also the data kind of that the search algorithm can use in order to predict basically what the next user who has the same search query actually is looking for, the same or a related one, because they make inferences. So this is basically the input. So they gave us kind of for each of these 5 buckets, they gave us 1,000 randomly chosen search queries. And at the same time, in the same week, from the same country, Germany, kind of we got via an API, we got the search results from Google and from Bing in order to make it possible that we also make cross search engine comparisons. Right? So then next challenge, okay, we have to come up with metrics for quality. And here I could kind of speak a long time. I will try to keep it short, kind of because not so much has been around. Kind of there are basically 2 empirical papers on search engine quality, and they use different metrics, so we developed kind of lots of them ourselves. The one category of quality metrics is human assessment. So effectively, we chose 500 random queries from these different buckets, and then we had research assistants and 587 so-called click workers. Click workers is kind of that's a German company. Think Amazon Turk. So people who can online who do little tasks, right? But in this case, they come from Germany in order to keep the cultural and language context the same, but languages were German and English. And so, and they basically then what they see is they get a search term, and then they get a result list, like 5 URLs, without any context, completely anonymized. They do not know from which search engine this is coming. Some of these results that we even mix from several kind of search results. So they just have, and then they asked like which of these results, which of these URLs is the best, which is the second best, and how do you like the entire search result? Is it helpful or not? Like on a 1 to 7 scale. So that was happening in human assessment. At the same time, kind of we did on the entire data set, kind of that scales more, we did machine, kind of I'll come to that, kind of we did a machine generated kind of quality assessment regarding the overlap that clicks the search engine could generate with Google's search results, assuming that Google gets it right? And so how close can you get to Google? But I'll show you. Now, so this is the first, this is the rough, the bird's eye view result here. And so what you see here kind of on the vertical axis, this is this is the average quality assessment from human assessors. And what you see is, oh yeah, so then actually the right, the red bar is Google, the green bar is Bing, so you have confidence intervals on average, and the blue one is clicks. So the first insight is, oh yes, even if we anonymize, there's no brand effect or whatever, kind of Google's quality is perceived to be significantly higher than Bing's, which is perceived to be significantly higher than clicks search quality. Okay. Now, so far, so good. Now, why is that? And if let's because the key question is, and that relates very much to what Peter just said. So, is that true? So, is Google does Google have the best quality because they have so much data, or because they're just smarter? They have the better algorithm, right? And so, what we did is basically first have a look, kind of again comparing these search results, and here, but now according to buckets. So you see the left panel is the most popular queries, and it ranges until the rarest queries. Now, what you see is basically that for the first 3 panels, roughly speaking, kind of clicks can very well keep up its quality level with Bing and with Google, right? Which tells us first, actually, the algorithm is not so bad. The algorithm is good enough to answer search queries such that kind of users like it. They are satisfied, and at the same level, roughly speaking, than Google and Bing. So the algorithm is okay. However, the problem is if we get to the 2 right boxes, right, this is where you see that clicks really has quality problems. So that's the major issue. And now you could say, oh yeah, but these are just rare queries and rarest queries. Now, but the elephant in the room is that these 2 boxes, buckets 4 and 5 together, constitute for 74% of all traffic. So this is where the music is playing. It's not the left ones, right? So clicks results are significantly worse than Google's and Bing's for the rare and rarest queries. Next one. This is a within search engine comparison. So now we are looking into clicks. We keep the algorithm constant, and we only play with the amount of data that the clicks' algorithm has access to. So these numbers that you see here, if you just have a look at the so that's what I just showed you. If you just have a look at the blue kind of bars, this is exactly what you see here on the very right, where it says 1.0. Because 1.0 means where here the algorithm had access to all of the data that clicks has about these respective search queries, where people in earlier times kind of clicked on. If we go to the left, 0.5, 0.2, 0.1, and so on, there we artificially drop earlier data. So with the clicks' algorithm had to come up with a search result list, but had less information about the previous preferences of users, right? And what you see again, so on the vertical axis is human assessment, is quality. So what you see is for the top 3 curves, kind of these are the most popular, and so in total the 5% most popular queries. Here it's sufficient to have like 10 or 20% of the data that clicks actually has to get to a relatively high and stable kind of quality level. Right, and then so there not so much happens here. So if they would get more data here, probably they couldn't improve very much. However, if you have a look at the 2 lines, the 2 lower lines, the rare and rarest queries, so here kind of you see that even at full data that clicks has, kind of the curves are still increasing. Implication: if clicks had more data on rare queries, they could improve. Just same algorithm, right? So this is the cleanest causality that you can imagine. Yeah, so here the dependent variable kind of is quality as a human assessment. This is a robustness check where we kind of do exactly the same thing, but the dependent variable is quality, measuring kind of a similarity score. How similar is the search result, the 5 URLs that clicks can produce, as compared to Google's results on the same queries. And effectively, you see exactly the same thing, right? So for popular queries, more data would not help so much. However, for the rare queries, which constitutes 74% of all traffic, here, if clicks had access to more data, to more user data, it would help them in the quality mechanically, right? So that's a strong result. Now that basically answers kind of the link on the left between, yes, more data lead to more quality, right? And then now the next question is, So if one search engine has better quality, do users actually care? Or do they have other preferences, for instance, in particular with respect to privacy? And for that, actually, so we did a second study, a second paper in the LIS panel. The LIS panel is a representative household panel in the Netherlands, so representative for the entire population, kind of managed by Center Data, which is kind of a non-profit research institute on the campus of Tilburg University, but independent. And they've run this panel for the past 15 years, actually publicly accessible, cool stuff. Now we've had 821 respondents. We know all of the background characteristics, so we could also do lots of other stuff, including do more or less religious people, answer more in this and that kind of area. Super interesting from my perspective, but not for today. So, and then basically, what we do is a discrete choice experiment. So that basically people sit in front of their screen and they must decide between two hypothetical search engines. Again, no brands, no names dropped here. Later on, there's a survey about the preferences, but kind of here, and they see, okay, so search engine 1 is characterized in 3 dimensions, namely what is its quality, how many advertisements do I have among the top URLs show up, and what is the degree of personalization. And more personalization implies less privacy. Right? And the same for search engine 2. And so then search engine 1, and so in each of these 3 dimensions would come in 5 steps, where kind of the level 1, whatever, level 1 of personalization, so this is very little personalization. That would mean, okay, so the search engine does not use any data. Right? Whereas a degree of personalization 5 means it uses a lot of data that they have about you, people like your characteristics, and even from your browsing history, maybe even other data that they find on your computer, right? So, and these would be characteristics kind of the 2 hypothetical search engines, and then the subjects say, okay, I would prefer search engine 2 in this case, right? And from that you can you get infer demand and so on. So that's what we did, and here is the main result. The main result is, so you have 3 panels, so that's the left is quality of results, then number of advertisements, then degree of personalization. So, and what you see is basically, if we have a look at the quality of results, kind of the benchmark category is always kind of the highest level, so level 1. So as compared to the highest quality level, kind of the second highest quality level, or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth, kind of leads to lower consumer satisfaction. Second panel, more advertisement that I see leads to lower consumer satisfaction. Third category here, degree of personalization, or you say less privacy. Also less privacy clearly leads to less consumer satisfaction and less consumer choices for a search engine that has the respective characteristic, right? So that's in qualitative terms, that's relatively clear. What is interesting, and you already see it a little bit if you have a look at the size of these bars, like if we if we have a coefficient, if we have a look at a coefficient of the linear specification of this conjoint analysis, then you see that actually the coefficient for quality is roughly twice as large as the coefficient of number of ads or personalization. What does that mean? It means, yes, people do not want to see ads. Yes, people value their privacy, but on this standardized scale from 1 to 5, kind of getting one additional step of quality is as valuable as 2 additional steps of advertisement or personalization. So if one search engine scores well in the quality dimension, it can post quite some advertisements, and it does not have to take care so much of personalization. People will still prefer this search engine. That's very clear. Now, and this concludes the circle, because that basically says more demand leads to more data in the search engine market, more data leads to more quality, and more quality leads to more demand. That's exactly the feedback loop, right? And so consequently, kind of in this market, a search engine that comes new into the market has no chance to stand against the incumbent. And consequently, this market is data-driven in the sense that I defined a couple of slides ago. And consequently, it should be kind of regulated by mandatory data sharing. Now, the next obvious question is, Okay, regulated by mandatory sharing. How do you do it? I don't have time, but I have a paper. So this is a paper kind of done also as part of kind of this research project together with Inge Graaf, who's a legal scholar at the Tilburg Law and Economics Center. And kind of fortunately, it's already kind of published end of last year. And so if you feel like it, and this is in particular, I mean, this is kind of what I'm trying to distribute these days very much among policymakers who have to decide actually how do we intervene in markets if we want. Here, this is only kind of how do we intervene, or this is one proposal, how to intervene, including a complete governance structure, incentives, who does what, technology, kind of there's lots of stuff in there, proposals, but we hope they make sense. And yeah, so we hope policymakers may pick this up, regulatory agencies may pick this up, and if you want to discuss, I'm here to stand. Thank you very much.
I'll stay here and you can sit down if you want, but I'm only so I can look at the questions. Anyone online who wants to ask some questions, please do. Anyone in the room who wants to ask some questions, please do.
So it was all very nice, nicely rounded up, but are you not missing one bit at the very end, which is the harm? So the harm, actually, that you say that, okay, then it all goes around, and then the market will tip, fine. But don't you need to show that there is consumer harm before you introduce mandatory regulation?
So
right? Because the big platforms obviously argue that they innovate a lot, so there is no loss of innovation, and that there are all those startups that only start their business because they know that they can sell their innovation to them. So there are new entrants, and there is the innovation by the big platforms, which is their argument.
Yes. Which is their argument, and which is not very credible, to be honest. I mean, I would never be I would never challenge that a company like Google, for instance, is very innovative. But I do challenge that they're innovative in search engines. So that's, I mean, to my kind of consumer's perspective and what I've read, at least kind of the search engine has not developed too much over the last 10 years or so. And so at the same time, we do have quite some evidence, partly from committee hearings in front of the US Senate or so, where smaller startups, including Yelp and TripAdvisor, I mean, that were small at some point, kind of, where they heavily complained then when Google entered into the markets and said, look, they have so much data. I mean, it's okay, so now I'm leaving the realm of search engines, I have to admit, but kind of, I have so much data, they have so much data, kind of, and other resources, kind of, that they cannot stand a chance. And so this is clearly discouraging kind of smaller startups. And I'm sure that that several kind of young entrepreneurs are out there and they dream that Google may come in and may buy them. And I guess we will we will hear something about killer acquisitions by Kuhn tomorrow. But I mean, we've had an informal chat, and so also there kind of was mentioning more that maybe these kind of buying up young startups is more kind of a human resources decision and not so much like a buying up of the technology that they've invented. And so that's but in the end, I kind of right now kind of I think it is just not enough as one of the most capitalized firms on the planet to say, oh, by the way, we innovate and you all suck because you don't get into the market, right? Importantly, I should mention that kind of, I mean, the theory of harm is based on the theory, on the two theory papers that I have there. This theory does not assume that Google or any other company does anything evil. They're just smart. They understand what the economics of data-driven markets is, and they understood this before anybody else. And this is why they're kind of first, and this is why they have this fantastic kind of run and market valuation and made tons of profits, right? So that's very important. This is completely different from everything, from all of the cases that we've seen in Google Shopping or about self-preferencing and what have you, kind of the competition policy part, which is also why this is a problem that competition policy cannot tackle. You must intervene by regulation ex ante. Like, yeah.
Yeah, my only point was that that's also an empirical question, whether there is the harm or not. You know, they say something, you say something.
I mean, so
you
the-
need to
I
look
mean,
at
I'm
it.
going to close you down because we're really running out of time. I mean, I think what Jens did is prove empirically two theoretical links that no one had proven before. So we're getting, you're asking him to prove everything all at once. But I'm actually going to probably stop questions for now. I'm very sorry, but we can have some more questions at the end maybe, because we should move on. I'm afraid you will have recognised that our third speaker is not at the front, even though we were hoping to have an all in person at least presenter, but unfortunately he has the dreaded COVID. So he has very kindly agreed to still present to us, but he from his home in Florence, which is obviously a tragedy to still be in Florence. But hopefully, let's see if we can get him up. And it's Giacomo Calzolari is Professor of Economics at European University Institute in Florence.
So really, thanks a lot for having me, and I'm deeply sorry I could not be in person with you. As Amelia mentioned, unfortunately, quite some days ago, I got COVID, and I'm still testing positive, and according to Italian regulation, I have to stay at home, so I could not catch my flight. Can you just tell me if you can see my slides now?
We can.
Excellent, very good. So thanks a lot. It's really an honor and a pleasure for me to give this talk, and in particular in this session, which is very, very focused on data, and in particular on recommender system, which is the topic of the paper I'm presenting, which is joint work with a group of co-authors have been working on since quite a lot of time on artificial intelligence and impact of it on competition. So Emilio Calvano, Vincenzo Nicolò, and Sergio Pastorello. So the paper of today is about, as I said, algorithmic recommendation and its impact on competition. So it's very related to Peter's and Amelia's paper, the first paper in the session. So I will be short on the motivation. So recommender systems are everywhere. Let me just give you an example that probably is less common. As an editor of a journal in IO, I now receive systematically recommendations for reviewers of papers that I'm receiving. And I can tell you that in the last 5 years, the recommendations have improved a lot, and they simplified the work of editors quite a bit with respect to the past. So recommenders are software programs that collect information on users' valuation for items that have been tried in the past by some users, and use this information in order to predict the value to individual users of items that have not been tried yet. It's a remarkable application of what computer scientists nowadays call personalized artificial intelligence, because it's artificial intelligence that really targets individuals. Now, why do we care? They are already there. They are affecting in a dramatic way user choices. You have just some numbers here. Let me state up front that with examples, starting with examples I gave in the very first introductory words, I think the recommender systems are fantastic, tremendous tools. They come as often with artificial intelligence with cons as well. And there are worries and claims about the risk with algorithmic recommendations. Peter has discussed a lot about them. There is a heated policy debate on the risk on competition, and even for democracy when the recommendation manipulated. There is a risk of a rich get richer effect, which means that recommenders may, in some sense, exasperate popularity, reinforcing the power of and amplifying competitive advantage. So we decided to look into it. So, so the research approach we followed is the following. We operate a natural recommender system in a synthetic and controlling environment, which means that synthetic means that we design preferences and products as economists can have started to do. And we do this in a controlled environment, meaning that we can control the data that the algorithm is using. So this approach that we use in the past to study, for example, the impact of artificial intelligence on pricing decision has two challenges. Well, the first challenge is that the algorithms that we're going to use must be similar to those that are actually deployed in markets. And the second is that the environment, economic environment that we are using must be realistic. So let me jump into the conceptual framework of the recommender system. Although Peter already said something, I want to dig a little bit more into the idea. The starting point is what is called rating matrix, capital R. So what you have here is a toy example. In the rows, you would have the users, the different users. In the columns, the different possible items. And what you see here is, for example, for user 1, this user has tried the product B and left a rating of 4.5, which is much better than how much this user liked the other item that is tried, which is item C, which is just where the rating was just 2.0. So recommender systems, they start using this type of data, the rating matrix, and the particularity of the rating matrix is that it's a matrix that has number of rows equal to the number of users, a number of columns equal to the number of items. And the second and most important element is that these matrices in reality are very sparse. So the complement of this is that the density, so the numbers that you would, the percentage of numbers of non-blank cells that you would find in a rating matrix is very small, in the order of 1% to up to 10% in the best case scenario. So the task of a recommender system is actually filling the blanks. And so there are prediction tools that allow to fill all the blanks that you see here. And it's based on an idea of collaborative element, where essentially the algorithm is going to pull together the observed ratings, the non-blanks entries in the population, and then estimate the unobserved ratings. So in particular, the algorithm that we're going to use is, I'm happy because Peter already mentioned the class of algorithms that are available, so I will not spend time on that. We are using what is called collaborative filtering of the model-based type. The idea of collaborative filtering, as the same word says, is based on collaboration. Roughly, the idea would be, as Peter said, using the correlation between preferences of different users. The problem is that if you try to really nail down the correlations with gigantic data sets, remember, a realistic rating matrix is not the one I've shown you before here, as millions of users and millions of items. If you work with this type of matrix, even calculating correlation is impossible. That's why computer scientists have moved within the class of collaborative filtering to this idea of model-based. In a nutshell, a model-based algorithm is very simple, and it is in these four steps that you see here. So it's assumed a parsimonious model on how the ratings are built. They're built on K factors, where K is chosen either by the computer scientists or by the algorithms. And for each factor, there will be a user dimension, what we call theta IH, which is the proclivity to factor H of user I. If you want to give a meaning of that, think about how much user I likes sugar. Then the second dimension is the item dimension, the beta ijh, which is the intensity of that factor H on item J. In that case, would be the amount or the percentage of sugar contained in item J, in product J. Then the factors are simply combined with a simple vector product, okay, as you see in the expression here. That's the model assumption. Step 2 is estimating these vectors of parameters theta hat and beta hat. And this is done by minimizing some accuracy loss on the basis, of course, of the observed ratings. Step 3, once you have these estimates, theta hat and beta hat, you can simply reconstruct every missing entries, again, by using vector product, now this time with the estimated theta hat and beta hat. Step 4, then for any single user, you can rank estimated ratings or together with observed ratings, and then you can start recommending the best product or the 10 best product. That's the model-based collaborative filtering algorithm, which is one of the most common algorithms because, as I said, it is very effective in managing and dealing with these gigantic matrices. And by the way, it's also the winner of the Netflix challenge, which is a challenge that Netflix launched a few years ago with a $1 million prize to the open community of computer science for those who were able to improve some percentage with respect in terms of prediction ability with respect to what they were using as an algorithm. So a few words on the literature. There is now a growing literature in economics. I will be very short on this. The main problem with this literature, which is very interesting, gives a lot of insight, is that the algorithms that they are using is very stylized. In fact, they're not using algorithms. They're using, let's say, kind of black boxes. But we don't know how much these black boxes would be actually close to the actual algorithms. Then there is a computer science and management literature that instead uses actual algorithms, but still we claim that there are some problems with these papers. For example, in some papers in management science, I've seen algorithms, recommender systems as a reduction of the search costs that users are facing, which is, in our opinion, not the case because they would be missing completely the collaborative element of a recommender system. And then there is this computer science and, again, management science, management literature that study the superstar effect, especially the feedback loop that Peter was mentioning before. In that case, the problem is that they're missing what we think a relevant economic benchmark, and they never look at actual implication in markets as we would think about as economists, which is price competition. So what I want to cover quickly, the next steps are, first, I want to present the economic environment that we're going to use. Then I will illustrate the simulated environments and the protocol for the simulations, and then eventually I will end up with the results. So the economic environment is the following. We build a model that mirrors this latent factor structure of the algorithm that I was mentioning before. So we're gonna use a discrete choice model with product differentiation that has embedded systematic correlations across consumers so that we give the possibility to recommend a system to actually exploit this correlation and be useful. So the synthetic preferences of our users are, as you see here. The structure of the preferences is as in the latent factor model. We add a random utility logic, we add a random component of extreme value type. So we end up with a random utility with logic errors that are IID. And then we design these individual preferences, theta IH, as I was saying before, uniformly distributed over a unitary circle. And similarly with synthetic products are designed unpicking these beta JH parameters. We study an environment with pure horizontal differentiation where these beta are, again, also in this case, distributed over the unitary circle. Then we study a case of pure vertical differentiation and an intermediate case. And this is what we end up with. So there are, essentially, I'm going to show you the results were 3 levels of differentiation according to this parameter alpha. When alpha is 0, we are in a model of pure horizontal differentiation, alpha 0.5 mixed differentiation, and alpha equal to 1, we have a case of pure vertical differentiation. So the way these work consumers are unaffected by the alpha. What changes is the positions of the beta of the different products that we're going to use. So, for example, on the left-hand side, you see the typical, that would be a SALOP model, pure horizontal differentiation, where both consumers and products are aligned on this circle, actually quarter of the circle. And in the pure vertical case is that you see that it's going to be one product, which is the product on the 45 line degree here. So the blues are the products here. So this guy here is going to be perceived as a better product by all the consumers. Probably is that consumers do not know the match value of each one of these products. So we're going to define market in a very simple way. Although there are many different products, not all products are necessarily competing one with each other. It's only when actually consumer decide which one of the product to choose from across a given subgroup of them that we call M, that we can say that these M products are actually competing with each other. So the number of products in a market that we're going to indicate with capital M is not necessarily equal to the overall number of the products in the economy. Now, the experimental protocols, we need to fix a little bit some parameters, and we go through replicating the data set in the Netflix challenge. In the Netflix challenge that I was mentioning before, Netflix they gave away a subset of their original data set, and with the idea that this subset was representative of the original Netflix data set that nobody's apart the Netflix know or access to. And so here is you see the number of users, the number of items, the number of observation. In this case, Netflix gave a data set that had a density of 1.2%. And with a smaller number of items and users and observation, we build our data set with synthetic data with the same density. Then the algorithms that were used in the Netflix challenge were using from 40 to 100 number of factors in the latent factor models. And we use a similar, well, much smaller factor model. But in order to guarantee, so we use a number of factors that guarantees that the number of observations divided by the number of factors, so which gives you a measure of the number of observations versus the number of parameters that the model has to estimate, is the same as in the Netflix challenge. Okay, so how do we generate the data? We generate the data in two ways: exogenous data, where the data enter into the rating matrix randomly. Okay, so the algorithms will observe a rating matrix that contains some ratings that are generated via our demand and supply model, let's say, consumers and items model, as I was saying before. And each consumer, in this case, reports truthfully the experience utility, inclusive of the idiosyncratic shock. In order to assess the importance of the feedback loop mechanism, we also populate in another setup the rating matrix with data that the recommender system has generated, in the sense that through the recommendations that are followed by users, then the rating matrix is populated in this way. This is the case of endogenous data. For each one of the settings, which means each one of the parameters, parameterization, when we run one other simulation in order to smooth out idiosyncratic shocks. So now we need a benchmark. The benchmark that we're going to use is a search benchmark, where absent the recommender system, in the economic environment that was mentioned before, each consumer facing some search costs can decide to experiment, in terms of one of the different products, open the box, see what's the match value, and then decide whether to continue search or stop. And then we're going to, against this benchmark, we're going to consider the effect of introducing a platform that offers personalized recommendation with the recommender system. The last point I want to mention with the recommender system is that, and this is a novelty with respect to the paper that I circulated to the to the discussant, which is still very preliminary, is that we allow users, when they receive the recommendation, still to decide whether they want to search or not, okay? And this is going to have some important consequences. Last point, we assume that the recommender system does not manipulate recommendations. So eventually, let me go to the results. I will be relatively quick on the results. I think it's important to specify the environment that we are using. It took us quite a while to build an environment that we think is realistic and robust. And hence, now at this point, we are delivering some of the, what we think, interesting results. First effect on product market concentration. Assume away prices for the moment. I didn't say anything so far. I will come back on prices in a minute. If we look at the HHI index for market concentration, what we immediately see here, the case, comparing the case of individual search with pure horizontal differentiation, then you increase vertical differentiation till pure vertical differentiation, alpha equal 1, you see comparing these two numbers that the recommender system does systematically increase market concentration. This is the case of exogenous data. If you consider endogenous data, the tendency to increase market concentration is increased. So our environment confirms what has already been shown that in the computer science literature, that endogenous data have a role. Our claim is that the feedback loop is there, is present, but probably is not the first dimension consequence. And we don't find long tail effects. Now, is market concentration an issue? Well, as economists, we know that it's not necessarily an issue because you can have very concentrated market, which at the same time are very competitive market, because competition selects the best firms out there. And if instead market concentration is the outcome of some luck, then we know that not being based on merit, having market power is not a good thing. It's related to the market tipping that Jens was mentioning before. Now, then what we did next is we wanted to study the intensity of competition implied by the recommender system. And the way we did it in a very simple way for economists. So we studied the demand elasticity, essentially, of the demand mediated by the recommender system, and we compared with the individual search benchmark. Essentially, what we did, we calculated Nash equilibrium prices. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than just saying this because, as you imagine, the market is large, many products, many users, so there is no way to come up with closed form solution in this market, although as a theorist I would have liked. So we have to simulate Nash equilibrium. What we do is we use the typical iterated best response algorithm that is used in empirical I/O. And let me cut short and go to the results. Here is the median quantity weighted prices in the three cases. Again, horizontal differentiation, mixed horizontal and vertical differentiation, pure vertical differentiation, and then you have the individual search, so the prices that would emerge with individual search, the price that would emerge when the users are helped by the recommender system with exogenous data, and then with endogenous data. Okay, so what you see is a remarkable reduction in equilibrium prices thanks to the recommender system, even if you account for the feedback loop. So we're talking about, in some cases, price reduction of 50%. So let me skip this in terms of time. Now, the next question is, why? How can be the case? We think we have an intuition for this, and it has to do with what recommender systems do in terms of estimation of the different preferences. And the idea is the following. You can, once you have the estimates of the recommender system, you can rank the different products for the different users, so you can tell how many units will be bought of any given product for a given price. So essentially, you can come up with a demand, a market demand for any single product. And this is what you see. These are estimated demand for a given product in one of our sessions, and this is what very frequently happens. The red line is the demand in the benchmark when users only respond by means of searching individually. And the blue line is the demand mediated by the recommender system. So essentially what you observe here is that the recommender system generates a counterclockwise rotation of the demand. And this has the price effect that we mentioned before. We also have an intuition of why we get this counterclockwise rotation of the demand. The idea is relatively simple. When you rely on individual search, if you think about the upper tail of the distribution of the match values, individuals will tend to actually select, of course, products that end up with high utility shock, relatively high utility shock rather than low utility shock. And this is true individual by individual because they are doing individual search. Now, the recommender system, on the other hand, pulls together the information that come from the different users. So it filters out essentially the shocks, and this creates homogenization of the estimates of the match value. So with this demand rotation, counterclockwise rotation, it turns out we can use an important result in a paper by Johnson and Myatt 2006 on a AR paper. And they show that this type of demand rotation can, in fact, reduce prices. Okay, so the equilibrium price that you would observe with the blue line, which is the recommender mediated demand, would be lower, as the previous table I was showing you illustrates. Okay, essentially, if you want simply this homogenization of the recommender system, counterclockwise rotation of the demand essentially makes the demand more elastic, if you want. So then we have, let me just give you 30 seconds on the biased recommendation. So what I showed you is unbiased recommendation. Now, what about, we know that a lot of discussion for recommenders is about the possibility that platforms using recommenders bias their recommendation. Now, there could be different reasons to bias. One possibility that we are currently exploring is the following. So imagine a situation in which among the different products, the platform gets a fee for any transactions, but there is one product, which maybe is the product owned by the platform itself. I don't make names here, but you can imagine what I'm in mind here. On that product, the platform, when there is a transaction, gets an extra fee or a higher return. Now, we can embed this, and actually we are doing some experimentation on this, and I can tell you that so far, the results suggest that the bias recommendation has an effect, which is relatively small and has ambiguous consequences on equilibrium prices. But this is really ongoing research. So summarizing, what we do in this paper, we show with a realistic environment using a realistic recommender system, a realistic economic environment, at least in our opinion, that the recommenders do increase market concentration, but at the same time, they have a consequential impact on intensifying competition in reducing the prices. And so they can be, in the end, pro-competitive from what we saw, even if they generate this increase in market concentration or superstar effect. And the controlling for endogenous data, it doesn't seem to be the main driver of our results. Then we have a very long to-do list that I will not have time to go through, but I would be happy to discuss more, and I guess there could be questions later on this. Thanks a lot for your attention.
So the one question I had, which wasn't intuitive to me, was on one hand, you had with a vertical differentiation, kind of an individual search, that the prices were actually lower on vertical than on horizontal, which is still intuitive to me, because if it's just vertical, that tends to be the case. But then the effect is much smaller of the price reduction when you're going to recommender systems. Do you have any intuition for that? Because I do think that we're getting a lot of kind of vertically differentiated systems that we're seeing more and more, and so I just kind of couldn't understand that from the framework that you had.
Sure. Yeah, that's an excellent question, because in fact, we are kind of proud of this structure of preferences, because we think it was very important for us as economists to bring into this analysis some of our tools. And in fact, differentiation, product differentiation, we think was very important to have. So answering your question, what we think is that when you have strong vertical differentiation, in a sense, the individual search and the recommender system do very good job altogether, because there is these key products that somehow kept it is easily discovered by the consumers. Okay, and hence there is not so much difference between the two approaches when you go to the very limit of vertical differentiation.
So essentially, recommendation is easier with vertical because everyone has the same relative preferences.
Yeah, but this is also...
Yeah. Okay, thank you very, very much, Giacomo. We're going to now move on to our two topic discussants. And first of all, I would like Joe to talk. He is Senior Vice President and Head of Research at Compass Lexecon. He was previously Chief Economist at Ofgem. Again, he may be happy he's not there at the moment. And before that, he was at NAO, who also got a mention earlier, but obviously more recent work. Anyway, he has huge experience. Joe, take it away.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Amelia. Before I get started, how long do we have? Are we?
Well, I think that we should still go for the amount of time that I gave you initially, which was 10 minutes. So it means the whole session will definitely be over by past.
All right. I will try to shave off a bit of time and give some time back, but let's see. So thanks very much for that. So I will give a few thoughts really about recommender systems in music streaming, which I think was the main motivating example, and then we went to lots of other interesting issues as well. I should say that I have previously worked for Spotify in the context of the EC's investigation into Apple, but I haven't had any direct involvement on the recommender system side. But before I get on to that, I just wanted to pick up on something I thought was very interesting in Jens's paper. This idea really of data as a public good, right? And the sense that, okay, this is a public good that is creating a very strong monopoly position because you let one company, let's say Google, have control over it. There is, of course, that almost a nuclear option saying, well, let's just open it up completely, which I think you were pushing towards. I do wonder about, actually, are there analogues to the patent and innovation world? This sense of, actually, companies are investing, of course, to get that data. They're providing lots of products to get that data. You might want to give them some extent of monopoly power as a result, but equally it's not obvious that the extent of monopoly power we in fact give them is the right answer, I guess. But anyway, there's a sort of interesting potential questions there, but I must admit I haven't thought it all through. Anyway, I will move on to music. So clearly there are potential issues around things like self-preferencing. Often the recommender system there is just one problem among many. So if you look at things like self-preferencing in the Apple case with Spotify and the like, it's partly about recommendations, but it's also a claim that Apple is degrading the quality of competing apps, or it may be channeling apps through its own proprietary systems. So the recommender system is clearly an issue there potentially, but it's not the only one. So I'm actually going to concentrate on really what Pete is calling homogeneity bias, which I think is a core recommender system only issue, essentially. And in music, this might be everyone listening to Taylor Swift or Ed Sheeran or something like that. In TV, everyone watching Game of Thrones. You might think those are bad or good, but hey. But you can also think of potentially bigger harms, such as things like echo chambers in politics or news. So people going into rabbit holes where they just see things that reinforce their beliefs, for instance, as a result of the recommender systems there. And because it's towards the end of the day, I'm going to try to be at least a little bit controversial. I will say that basically, absent self-preferencing, the platform's interest in recommender systems is largely aligned with consumers. That if you have a better recommender system, you get a better you get more consumers. But when there are learning or familiarization effects, which I think there clearly are in areas like music, people take time to get used to a new band or a new style of music. It is like recommender systems are likely to lead to inefficiently homogeneous choices. The people will stick to what they know, and I think that's what comes out of Pete's work. And that can be either or both of at the individual level or the aggregate level. So it could be everyone is clustering on one particular outcome, or it could be, I'm in a left-wing echo chamber, someone else is in a right-wing echo chamber, someone else is in a centrist echo chamber, I don't know. You're sort of, there is variety at an aggregate level, but maybe the individuals are only seeing a small amount of things. So, what's the answer to this? And listen up, this is the vaguely controversial thing. I think the answer is basically payola. The ability for entrants to be able to pay to access consumers via recommender systems. And that's got a very bad name. I think it's still illegal in the US for instance, for music companies to pay radio stations to promote music themselves. I'm getting a nod from Morton, so I'll take that. There are things that essentially approximate this. I don't know whether they are legal. So you've got things like discovery mode in Spotify, which gives content providers the ability to discount or to make payments up front. In discovery mode, it's essentially to give a discount. So it's saying we will accept lower payments per stream from an already arguably quite low level, frankly, but anyway, take lower payments still in return for being promoted more actively. And so this is essentially a way of saying, okay, we think this is, I think I have a song that people might not like initially, but they need the ability to listen to quite a few times, and once they do, this will be very popular and, hey, this will pay back my initial investment, essentially. Now, I think that is really crucial for getting exploration into these recommender systems and getting free entry, essentially, or improving the possibility for entrance, improving the kind of cold start issues that that Pete was talking about. Of course, that needs to be declared. So one of the issues in previous payola scandals was it was undeclared, and of course it should be. But provided it's declared, actually, I think this is potentially a very important factor in making these type of markets work. Now, I would say that I think this model is potentially beneficial on all sides, essentially, and so the market should, or certainly on the side of the platform and for consumers, the market should largely provide it. It might be harder in news or politics, where you have slightly strange markets, but in areas like music, at least, you might think the market will provide it. But I do think, conversely, the interventions that are talked about in this space will be highly prone to lobbying to prevent entry. There's some great quotes in Ronald Coase's work on payola, which I can't resist reading out one of them at least. So this is a congressional hearing here of a music company executive. Well, do you think without payola that a lot of this music, rock and roll stuff, which appeals to the teenagers, would not you think that kind of thing would be played anyway, regardless of the payola? Never get on the air. Do you think payola is responsible for it? Yes, it keeps it on the air because it fills pockets. So this is saying that actually the entrant technology then of rock and roll music was facilitated very strongly by payola. Whether that's actually true, I suspect there's some hyping up there. But it's a sort of, it is making, I think, what most people now would think is a good claim about the role of these sort of payments in promoting entrants. And I think you can see similar dynamics in some of the what's happened in Australia in the approach to news media, that you've seen, in my view, frankly, something like a shakedown of tech firms as part of a commercial dispute between Murdoch and Google/Facebook. I don't have any particular remit for Google, Facebook, or Murdoch in this sort of fight, but I do think actually the deals that are struck there potentially are excluding alternative news providers or making it harder for other types of news providers to compete. I'll shut up there. I've hopefully said something mildly controversial.
I would note that on Booking.com there is the equivalent of payola, where hotels do pay more to get further up the rankings, and it is revealed to consumers thanks to CMA intervention. Interesting question whether consumers have the foggiest how to deal with with all the information they're provided with. I hope that next year we see a nice evaluation of that at this conference. I will thank you very much. I'll hand over to Andreas. Andreas is at the CMA, and I managed to lose the piece of paper, but he's in the behavioural, he's the director of the Behavioural Hub.
Yes. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's right. I am at the CMA. I haven't been at Ofgem or any of the other regulators yet. And I am in the Behavioural Hub, which unfortunately also means I'm not an economist, but a behavioural scientist. I was reminded of why I'm not an economist going through the papers, but I was also enlightened by some of this really interesting research and how it overlaps with much of the stuff we do in the CMA and many of the analysis, market studies, market investigations that we have done through, over the years, and hopefully will be continued doing the upcoming years until the DMU comes and saves us all from sort of these problems in digital markets. So I'll be talking a bit about some of the analysis we've done. I won't specifically go into recommender systems to begin with. I'll end hopefully tying sort of the nut to why our work sort of overlaps with some of the stuff we've been talking about today. And preparing for this session, I looked over many of the market studies and consumer complaint cases and investigation, like more formal competition cases we have been running. And obviously all of them are digital to some extent. Like this is it's not even a question of looking at analog markets and digital markets or brick and mortar anymore. Like everything is digital, so that's one point. And obviously that means that we have to look at some of the qualitative differences between the old markets where people went into a shop and bought stuff and the new markets that are digital. And I think there are many, but 4 elements that sort of keep reappearing in our cases, in our analysis, which is that these markets, these new digital markets, are frictionless. We buy stuff, we can buy much more stuff much quicker from many more retailers, can access almost an infinite amount of retailers instantaneously. So that is something that is really qualitatively different from how it used to be. The search costs have sort of gone out the market. They are social. So social information is now sort of an inherent trait in the market. It's something we cannot miss. So all marketplaces both use social data as something to guide consumers, but as we've seen, it's also taken into sort of the very infrastructure of the marketplace, going into the algorithms, then going into recommender systems, using past behavior to guide future behavior. So the third point is they are dynamic and experimenting and able to very quickly change. Also something that's very different from our traditional brick and mortar store. And finally, they are of course data driven. So these 4 sort of qualities in digital markets is really at the heart of much of the work we're doing. And I'll get back to why I think it's interesting, because I think recommender systems are sort of driving right into all those 4 qualities. So I'll highlight 2 major analyses that we've done, and just to say my unit, the Behavioral Hub, is sort of positioned within the data unit, which we are really proud of. So I also want to highlight some of the work we've been doing in the data unit. And 2 major pieces of work we've been doing, and 2 analyses, are on algorithms and on online choice architecture. So to take algorithms, I think the analysis which came out last year, to a high degree sort of reproduces many of the concerns we've heard today. So we are concerned about how algorithms can harm consumers directly, if they misalign with consumer preferences, especially if they squeeze out minority groups, like all of these. So I'll just be repeating many of the things we've been hearing about recommender systems on that point. We also think, or are concerned about, whether they can increase market power. Again, very similar to many of the concerns we've heard. If firms use algorithms in the form of recommender systems or otherwise, they can be self-preferencing, and they can sort of, if the algorithm is incentivized in a certain way, it can sort of shift the market towards big market players with higher market power, which could be a problem. Obviously, this is all something so far very difficult to demonstrate empirically. And they can increase the risk of collusion, especially if they are very advanced. And it can be very difficult to detect collusion. We no longer sort of have the smoking gun that we had in the past, because all of this is happening automatically. So that is one piece of work that sort of overlaps with the theme of this conference. So the other is our work on online choice architecture, which came out just a couple of months ago in May. And in this, we basically outline a taxonomy with three main categories of how firms can use choice architecture, essentially just the design of the interface with the firm and the customer to influence consumer behavior. So we outline how firms can use choice information, choice pressure, and choice structure. And again, and you may be detecting a theme here, we are concerned with the harms caused, the possible harms caused by online choice architecture, again, directly to consumers if it is sort of subverting their choices or manipulating them into something they wouldn't have chosen otherwise. We are also worried about how online choice architecture can increase market power. This is again very similar. So if firms can use online choice architecture to guide behavior, they can sort of self-preference, or they can keep consumers within their ecosystems. Those are our concerns. And obviously, we are also worried about whether firms will be investing into online choice architecture development that is harmful, rather than sort of investing into making their products better and their services better. So we are also concerned about harm to innovation in markets. So, basically, I think these two analyses, and also many of the market studies we've been doing, basically it embodies much of the stuff we've been hearing today. So I think recommender systems really are, in a very central way, algorithms and online choice architecture. So they are inherently algorithmic because they take information, social information, and use it to sort of continuously take those inputs and output something to consumers. And that something is inherently choice architectural because the algorithm needs to guide the consumer in a certain way, and how it does it, we heard a bit about that in the first presentation, can have very strong different, like it can have very different effects on how the consumer uses that information to then pick a product. So basically, does it recommend one? Does it recommend many? Are they ranked? Are they, are they presented side by side? All of these things matters, and all of these things can influence how the consumer is affected by it. So, in essence, I think looking at how we talk about how we will handle these problems with online choice architecture and algorithms is probably very indicative of how we will be working with recommender systems. So looking at looking at sort of these analyses, what are we really saying? How will we regulate these problems, and how are we going to solve it until obviously the DMU comes along and solves everything for us? And one of the first ways is basically internal, like within the CMA. So one of the ways we are talking about engaging with these problems is basically learning how firms are thinking, investing into new skills, new methodologies, new ways we can investigate markets. So again, this is some of the stuff we're very proud of. Like, we are investing heavily in these capabilities. So we have data scientists, we have data engineers, we have people who are able to allow us to more proactively understand how markets evolve, and basically how maybe algorithms and online choice architecture is shaping markets in some sense. And this is very different from the traditional, or more traditional sort of reactive regulator who waits for a complaint or waits for some very explicit harm to happen, and who then does an investigation. So what I mean by this is we can, for instance, use and have abilities to scrape markets continuously and see how they evolve and sort of react before problems arise. So that's one way we are going to engage with these problems in the future. Looking specifically at at algorithms and, by extension, recommender systems, we can and probably will provide better guidance, also using our digital capabilities to sort of come up with realistic and guidance that is implementable by firms. So that could include guidance on how recommender systems needs to be transparent, although we do share concerns about how effective transparency is as a remedy for some of these problems. So how much information can consumers really take in? It can include guidance on data handling and obviously guidance on fairness. So how can we make sure the recommender systems are fair for everyone and that they will continuously evolve and to be fair and represent all consumers in a fair way. And obviously, and this is sort of the last point, we will run cases. So hopefully setting some buy-through cases both in the consumer and in the competition domain. We will set some precedents for going forward and make sure that these algorithms and how they are presented to us benefits all of us.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to give us another 5 minutes if we need it, which sets all the wrong incentives, for any further questions that anyone has. Oh, so there's actually, maybe there's two over here. Should we have both of the ones on this row?
Can you hear me? Joe, I've been sitting on that payola question that you mentioned, just listening to the whole panel today, and I was thinking, we've always had these issues that superstars were popular. I mean, this is not entirely new. But what seems to me is that the recommender system sort of put them on steroids. And we could see that from Giovanni's paper that they do increase market concentration, and Peter's paper is showing it as well. The superstar effect is very strong. So they have created a problem for a whole part of the market, or supercharged the problem. And now the solution, which I sympathize with, because it is a solution. You are asking the sort of a smaller artist in that big fat tail to take a hit to remedy a problem that was created for them. I can't see it as somehow positive. And I'm coming from the sort of consumer's perspective. I keep getting Adele's recommendation, and I really hate it, and I never listen to her. So I don't feel I am being served well as a consumer. And you can see that this is creating problem in music. It's very clear, and there is the whole industry is talking about it. It is not a new thing. You also have gatekeepers, very strong gatekeepers in the music, the big labels. So as a customer, I'm not feeling that this is a solution for me. I sympathize with Peter, it may not be a competition issue, but it is an issue that was created by or amplified by the recommender system. So I'm slightly skeptical. I can see why you would see it as a solution, but it doesn't feel like it entirely.
Yeah, thank you. Doesn't matter, I guess. No? So the one question is, maybe this is true for all the panel. If you look at these long tails or the role of the
Can you see if you can get it on? I think they can't hear online if you can't get it on.
Oh, it is on.
Is it on now? Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. So let me restart then. If you look at these long tails, and then there is one aspect which is important here to remember is how good are we fitting on something that we have very little information, in the sense we can get this kind of, large exposure to the other one because we know a lot, but when we get to the one we have very few instances of purchasing, I think like Giacomo table was a very nice one to look, that's very hard on a typical way to predict what will be the recommended for a consumer there. This goes back for those of you that done econometrics, you sometimes have missing values and they're starting saying you can simply take an average, interpolate. Then with something more sophisticated, come and say, no, it's not something better. You should also take into consideration all the other observable characteristics that you have. Then you get a better, if you want, value for your missing value. And that's where we will be with some of these platforms, we are there. But one important aspect is some of these platforms know more. They know the big data. They know something, for example, although you observe very little in terms of outcome, you know a lot about consumer, what he did at that point in time. So that user, how many times does he go to the bathroom a day? What time was when he purchased? How hot was it? How many people were around? Which noise was it around it? So this information can be used in a way to create, to help, if you want, to get the right, if you want, prediction on something that otherwise you can make the mistake of missing out. And I wonder if different platforms have access to different data. Is an advantage that can be there on the table or not?
Okay. Peter.
Yeah, thank you. Just to respond on Franco's point briefly, yes, it is difficult to recommend products in the long tail, but so some methods and admittedly the bigger platforms are using methods that are based on things like reinforcement learning, where there's a lot more exploration. These are called kind of epsilon greedy methods, which means that a certain percentage of recommendations are based on what they know for sure that you would like, but they always mix in kind of an epsilon percentage of recommendations which are experimental, and they see how you respond to that, and from that they really can improve their understanding about you as a consumer. But problem with this is that they're really difficult to scale, and they're hugely resource intensive. So you have to be a big platform to be able to do this.
They also involve deliberately giving people what might be bad recommendations in the short run for long-term benefit. But if you are on the end of a bad recommendation, you may not see that as a long-term benefit.
And just a small point on the payola. I should have said at the start of my presentation that, of course, we are actually looking at music and music streaming, but I just wanted to bring out the more general points. But I think Joe's idea is, I actually sympathize with it, because what it would create is a transparent system as opposed to the system we currently have, where we don't know how much influence major labels have on creating editorial playlists. We don't know how often they go and talk to those editors. We don't know what other payment incentives the editors receive for putting stuff on the editorial playlist, which are the major drivers of streaming activity. So with a payola, if it's transparent, at least we would know this. So it's a bit like, knowing on Google which product is advertised and which one isn't.
Could I just come in just very briefly? It's a good question, of course, Alan. One response, actually the music industry has been concentrated for a long time, right? If you look at Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale of the 19th century, she was being paid $100,000 a concert in real terms now, right? It's not, Adele was very popular before Spotify and will be very popular after Spotify, I'm sure. So it's not obvious that actually recommender systems have made that problem worse. I think it's still a legitimate challenge. You might say, hey, I want recommender systems to explore without needing a payola equivalent. The problem is, though, everyone would want to have a prominent position, right? You need some way of giving a kind of signal that is costly to the record company or whoever, that this is something that we think is good in the long term, that will have real possibility in the long term. And unless there's real money behind that, that's pretty hard to do, right? There may be.
So I think we're going to leave everybody. I think I'm going to have to close down the questions because we have to let everyone go. But I think we've left everyone with a really interesting research question: is payola good? I thank you very much to the panel. Thank you very much to all of you, and we'll see you bright and early tomorrow morning.